起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位点传是一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
And welcome everybody to another glorious Sunday, and it is. It's in the upper 40s, maybe to middle 50s here in Indianapolis right now with a light spring breeze and a few clouds. But it's not snowing, and we're not all frozen, so I'm very thankful. Once again, as always, it's truly a joy to see all of you online with us this morning. Ever since the day Derek and I started doing this, I've always been both amazed and extremely grateful for all of the people who join us on Sundays. It's really kind of a cool thing to stop and think about where this Tao message goes on a week-to-week sort of a basis, and even after that over the internet. It just something that reminds me of well, it's humbling. Let's just put it that way. Today I want to chat with you about salvation. This is not your typical Southern Baptist hellfire and brimstone sort of a sermon. It's a little different, although my initial spiritual path was headed directly for the Southern Baptist Seminary. Things in my life kind of happened along the way that changed that course somewhat. I think that this particular topic is one that needs to be covered from time to time, particularly in the West, because there is such a wide chasm of understanding between the typical Western view of many of the spiritual and metaphysical terms that we use and the ideations that we bring with us into the temple, and the genuine and authentic viewpoint of the Tao. And so there's a very fertile breeding ground for misunderstanding and misinformation and confusion. So, every now and again to talk through some of those similarities and differences is a good and beneficial thing to do. In the West, predominantly, what we're dealing with are the various Judeo-Christian traditions. And please understand that, especially on this topic, I'm speaking from a standpoint of my own beliefs, my own views, my own values, my own particular spiritual pursuits and ideals. And so you can all feel free to accept or reject anything that I say here this morning as it suits you to do so. And I promise I won't get my feelings hurt or anything. But anyway, as we go down the old gospel road, as it were, in the Judeo-Christian traditions, there are a number of concepts in there that most of us are taught from our earliest childhood. Whether our families are particularly religious or not doesn't seem to be terribly relevant. What denomination we're following doesn't appear to have a lot to do with it. It is kind of the collective, universally understood Judeo-Christian beliefs that we get indoctrinated with from our earliest childhood. Where that starts very, very frequently is that there's a concept of what's referred to as original sin. And the concept of original sin feeds into a lifelong obsession with and life spent committing sin. We are born imperfect. We are all born into sinfulness, and we spend our entire lives coming up short of salvation because we are powerless to do anything about it. This is based traditionally upon the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, where, as you'll all recall from the well-known parable, that Eve was deceived by the serpent and ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then persuaded Adam to do the same thing. That was the original sin, and it caused Adam and Eve to be cast from the utopian Garden of Eden, and for the serpent, Satan, who deceived the woman, to be beset with his own unique set of punishments and issues. Because of that original sin, because we're born into sin, we are all from birth unworthy of salvation. That is to say, that our eternal soul from the moment of birth is virtually doomed to burn forever in hell. And because we are born unworthy of that salvation, an intercessor is required to buy our salvation for us, to pay the price of that sacrifice. Of course, in the Judeo-Christian faiths, that individual is Jesus, who was born, died on the cross, and was resurrected 3 days later in atonement for the original sin and the sins of the world. Okay. Another very common tenet of most of our currently existing denominations is that once one is saved, that salvation is permanent, that there's nothing one can do after having achieved salvation to become unsaved, as it were. And that the reward of that salvation, of course, is eternal life after death, blessed life where everything's perfect, nothing hurts, all of our needs and wants are provided for, and that's where we spend forever. And of course, conversely, if we fail to do so, eternal punishment becomes the consequence of our short-sightedness. So that's kind of the fundamentals in a nutshell. In addition to that, we have a number of personified deities and other beings. Most notably, we have God. And the reason that I speak about this personified deity as much as I do is because in the Western practice of these traditions, the word God actually fetches up a very unique and singularly common mental picture, if you will, of an older gentleman with a long white beard and white hair holding onto a shepherd's crook, standing there at the gates of heaven saying, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." There are angels, all sorts of them, some of whom are sent to earth from time to time to mete out the will of God, some of whom are not. There is also Satan, whose existence predates Christianity by thousands of years, but that's a whole other discussion, and the angels of hell, demons and what have you, the darker forces, if you will. What they all have in common is that they share both a human appearance, if you will, and human attributes. We ascribe, for instance, to God that mental image of someone who looks remarkably like Santa Claus. The devil, Satan, is always a somewhat more insidious looking, yet very much humanoid figure, usually found with horns and a tail, although the appearance of Satan over the centuries has changed much with the evolution of the traditions. And by ascribing those human attributes and appearances to those supernatural entities, in the case of God, if you will, by placing upon that deity the human attributes of a body and a face and human thoughts, we instantaneously limit the divine to what we understand of other people. He's no longer infinite and omniscient and omnipotent, but rather has been relegated into a category of deities that kind of remind us of our grandpa. Same thing with the darker forces. Once we humanize them, we limit them. Which, okay, they're darker forces, maybe limiting them isn't such a bad thing, but I'm not sure it's a realistic thing. And whether or not they appear to us in a limited or limitless form, both sides stand at the fronts of a battle of good versus evil. And in the middle are the countless human souls that through no fault or doing of their own happen to be pawns in this battle for the souls and minds of humans. That battle for souls is the primary reason stated for why we all need salvation, why we need to be saved, and not saved from the presumption of supernatural evil, but saved from ourselves, saved to become better people through the application or indwelling of a spiritual entity, once again outside ourselves, that gives us the ability to become the people we ought to be. There's also the concept of heaven and hell, not yin and yang, not a complementary pair in this particular case, but one being the place of ultimate utopian perfection, and the other being the ultimate place of pain and suffering. And then, of course, along with all of that is the prayers and supplications of those who are hoping with all of their hearts to avoid that eternal punishment. And okay, having started out my life headed down the road towards becoming a Southern Baptist minister, I'm fairly well acquainted with the power that can be produced by instilling the fear of eternal punishment in the hearts and minds of other people. It is not necessarily a person's innate desire to become the person they ought to become a holier, more righteous, more upstanding person with more integrity and more virtue, as it is to avoid the punishment of an unseen and eternal everlasting hell. From that perspective comes the transactional prayers and supplications, where we imagine at some level that God or one of the supernatural beings is going to save us from all sorts of potential evils in our lives, both small and great. The small, or the greatest perhaps, being that fear of being sent to hell, and a lot of the rest of them falling under the category of, if you help me pass this algebra test, I'll never do and fill in the blank here ever again. There's a particular view, a philosophical bent, if you will, also surrounding death within the Western view of salvation and divinity. It's a viewpoint that death is that time in a person's life when the rewards and the punishments are meted out and each soul is judged. There are a variety of different scenarios under which this process unfolds in the most Western traditions, but the core tenets are there. There's the death event, the judgment event, and then the meting out of either rewards or punishments. There's a belief that only a few people are actually savable, that when it comes right down to it, the vast majority of humanity is going to burn forever in hell, and those few who are able to both achieve salvation and then live a virtuous enough life to hang on to it are saved to that eternal life in heaven. This represents something of a contradiction to the philosophy of permanent salvation, and yet it still persists. There's further a large school of thought that says that a person's ultimate destiny, their ultimate fate, the outcome of their lives, if you will, is determined by circumstances completely outside their control. That from the beginning of time, a person's name was either written in the book of life or not, and that those who were recorded in the book of life were destined to enjoy heaven, while the rest were doomed to endure hell. And because of these various philosophies, these fears, these thoughts regarding what happens to us when we die, death has become something to be feared and avoided and held off for as long as humanly possible by any means necessary, so that we don't have to face the reality of a wrathful God based on the misdeeds of our lives when it's finally over. That kind of sums up the basic philosophies in Judeo-Christian thinking all over the United States. Very much all over the Western thinking portions of the world in one way or another. There are hundreds of variations on a theme there, but those things persist all over. Those thoughts, fears, philosophies, beliefs, call them what you will, are one of the huge stumbling blocks to right and appropriate Tao cultivation. They are a source of endless confusion for folks who are trying to figure out how best to apply the Tao teachings to their lives and still stay within the framework of a particular spiritual path. And before I go down the road of the Tao perspective on this, I think it's important to say right now that whether or not, or if one chooses to remain in a particular religious path, is not a decision that any of us in the I-kuan Tao intend to make for anyone else. That is to say that for those of you who find benefit and solace and comfort and your spiritual needs being met in one of these religious traditions, who also desires to learn the philosophical Tao to make life a little easier and smoother, that's just fine. And nobody's going to tell you you can't or you shouldn't, particularly not me. So once again, without wanting to offend or put people ill at ease, it is absolutely the truth that from time to time the meeting of the Tao philosophy and the traditional spiritual paths do cause some confusion and some room for issues in growth and evolution. They're not by any stretch of the imagination insurmountable, but if we know them and understand them, then things can work. The Tao perspective on all of the foregoing is essentially this: there is no original sin. That's under the purview of all things religious, and not necessarily under all things Tao. Does that mean that we never do anything wrong? Of course not. We all do. We all fall down from time to time. We all make mistakes. Sometimes we all do the wrong thing for the right or wrong reason on purpose. But we're not born into a state of some kind of spiritual deficiency that we require rescuing from. Okay? Because we're not born into a state of sinfulness or evil or badness, if you will, there's no need really for a salvation event. There's nothing to be saved from or to. There's no need for an intercessor to go between an individual and God. However you choose to picture God, there's just no need. What there is karma, the universal law of cause and effect. And each person makes their own. Now, that's not to say that certain things that create karma don't span lifetimes. They absolutely can and do. But that karma isn't created by some obscure universal act of vengeance or punitiveness. It's rather created by the choices and decisions of the persons who are doing whatever it is they're doing. There's also no need for a period of judgment, final clearing up of the accounts, the final reckoning of the soul. It is a remarkably common misconception in the West that karma is reserved until after death, once again, so that the consequences of that karma, be it good or bad, can be meted out on the soul after death. It is actually observably true that very frequently, John Lennon had it right, instant karma is going to be what gets us. It is amazing the rapidity with which both positive and negative karma can swing back around into a person's life and either deal out spectacular rewards or spectacular damage, depending upon what the person did and why. In the philosophy of the Tao, particularly as one grows and matures and develops their state of cultivation more closely towards sagehood and true wisdom, each person tends to make their own fate. I don't know that I'm expert enough to actually talk about that at a very deep level. I can say, though, that in my life, I think that's probably the truth. I may not always finitely control the choices and decisions that I make well enough sometimes to escape some negative karma or avoid some negative outcomes every now and again, but I know enough that I can recognize when those situations have occurred, and sometimes before they occur, so that I can mitigate the adverse outcomes of poor choices and bad actions. Being able to do that gives us the ability to create our own destiny, our own fate, our own future. We no longer are the victims of things that we feel are beyond our control. We actually are not only responsible for everything that we do, but we have the ability to exert influence over everything that we do. A lot of influence, actually. We can say, yes, we will do this. No, we will not do this. Maybe I'll do this, but I need to think about it some more. Those things happen every day, all the time. The only difference between the choices that we make on a routine, mundane level and the ones that bring about large karma is the perception of the scale of the event. When something appears to be too big, too cumbersome, too knotty to understand, too tough, then we tend to believe that what happened to us was the result of actions and movements outside of ourselves that we could not understand or control. But the truth is, if we had understood the situation better, we could have controlled it. In the Tao perspective, every soul is subject to change. It is the very nature of Tao cultivation that our spirits and what ego selves, if you will be transformed by the very process of cultivating the Tao teachings. That by supplanting the ego-driven needs, desires, and attachments to a moderated will and a desire for spiritual growth and evolution, we allow that true self within us, that spiritual component of us that is closely and tightly aligned with the Tao to come closer to the surface. And the closer to the surface that person gets, the better people we become, the more able we are to listen to that small, still voice, to allow the true self to emerge and to transform us, the more transformed we become. It's a fundamental tenet of Tao cultivation that we educate ourselves, that we train ourselves, that we learn and ask questions and avail ourselves to the wisdom of our older Tao brothers and sisters, the ordained masters, the sages, the people who've gone where we're trying to go, so that we can understand how to get there. And not every time do our queries result in life-transforming answers. Sometimes the answers create more questions. But even creating more questions leads us down the path to trying to answer them. And by going down that path, we ultimately find that we have evolved, that we have changed, that we've been transformed. It causes that evolution of mind and spirit that we all seek in Tao cultivation. It's one of the most miraculous things I think I've ever seen or experienced. In the Tao perspective, particularly in our unique philosophical approach to the Tao, there's not a personified deity out there. So there's no need for a transactional prayer relationship with the deity who's not listening to us anyway. Derek does a really neat little talk about all of the requirements in faith necessary to believe that prayer is working. I'm not going to run through the whole thing right now. It's already 3 minutes till 2. But we can say fairly safely that it takes an awful lot of faith to believe in your prayers being heard and attended to by an omniscient, omnipotent God, rather than by your own true self, which is in fact actually much closer to you. In Tao cultivation, that transactional prayer relationship is replaced by a sense of awe and gratitude that we're able day by day to experience a wonderful and miraculous life, both physically and spiritually, both in the secular, the mundane, and in the celestial, if you will. And it is truly a miraculous life. I see miracles in my life all the time. And okay, maybe it's a matter of perspective and explanation, and maybe I choose to see the miraculous. But I have also seen some things, as has Derek, and a couple of them we've seen together, where rational explanation by normal natural laws just kind of fail the event. That need for external salvation, that need for the intercessor, that need to beg to be saved from ourselves is replaced by individual spiritual transformation in Tao cultivation. We do it together, but each one of us is unique in what we need and what we think we want, and in our approach to cultivating the teachings, and therefore the transformations are unique as well. But the efforts that we put in towards achieving that spiritual transformation for each of us results in refinement of that spirit, and refining the spirit and transforming the person leads to the practice and accrual of wisdom, as opposed to just knowledge. It is, as I said previously, a wonderful and miraculous thing to watch. Perhaps more important than any of the ethereal stuff is the very real and pragmatic viewpoint on death from the Tao perspective. And there are a lot of people who cultivate the Tao who don't quite share my point of view yet. I know that, and I understand it, and it's okay. Don't feel that you're obligated or you have to at all. You certainly don't. But from what I've been able to observe on my own is that prior to death, for a cultivator of the Tao teachings, life itself is lived in alignment with the Tao, moving with the flow of the Tao, ever cycling stuff in and out and around and returning. Our lives tend to mirror the action of the Tao itself. And because of that, people can infer the unknown from the observable. We know that death is part of living. We see it all the time. Not usually really close to us, hopefully, but not uncommonly. You know, it's springtime here in Indiana. Every now and again, you drive down the road, you see a squirrel or a possum or a raccoon or some other poor animal that got sideways with a car. You know, our relatives die. Sometimes people much closer to us than aunts and uncles and what have you, pass away. And we miss them and we grieve them. But we still know that death is just a part of life, and eventually we're able to see it that way, where the fear and anxiety and overwhelming sense of loss about the death event is replaced by the understanding that everything that lives one day dies. And with that understanding, and perhaps the understanding that returning is the nature of the Tao, we can begin to accept that life itself is a cycle of those returnings. That, yeah, one of these days this body I'm wearing right now is going to die. It absolutely is. And although I may not be able to fully describe that part of me that transcends the death event, I know it's there, and it will persist past the death of this body, and maybe even return one day for another life in this wonderful place in a different body. The gates of heaven and hell is a wonderful story that's related about, and I can't go through this whole thing either, but basically relates an encounter between a Tao sage and a general, in which the general wants to know where the gates of heaven and hell are, and discovers that by becoming both very angry and amazingly humble and apologetic. Basically, the gates of heaven and hell are within all of us all the time. And to a Tao cultivator, because that's the truth, we do our best, and I think I can speak for all of us on this one, to get closer to the gates of heaven, if you will, than to the gates of hell. To nurture and cultivate the things that lift us up, that give us a more nurturing, more passive, more peaceful, more joyful life, rather than those that create the upheaval and ill will and conflicts that are represented by the gates of hell. In the Tao perspective, we don't look for either eternal reward or eternal punishment. There simply is karma, cause and effect. And of course, what I spend the vast majority of my time talking about here, that pragmatic spiritualism, where the spirit evolves, but the individual's life continues down the path, both in the secular and mundane and in the spiritual, better for it because of the Tao cultivation. Now, does that mean inside the Tao perspective that we don't have room for the metaphysical, for the supernatural, for the spiritual experiences? No, we do. But by and large, the day-to-day journey is one of what works day to day, moment to moment, sometimes second to second, depending on what situations we're in. It is real world, down to earth, just plain old living. The way down the path is simply the manner in which we follow the Tao to our best understanding, and relieves us from the anxieties and worries and pressures, if you will, of eternal punishment or eternal reward, or whether or not we're pleasing anyone other than the person who matters the most, and that's us, the true self within us, the person who knows whether or not we're being the person we should be. I'm running over and I apologize. I'll get through this quickly. The path of Tao cultivation is not so much about salvation or the absence of it as it is about living in the here and now. Salvation, or the absence thereof, will be decided day by day, moment by moment, depending upon the choices we make and the things we choose to do. And instead of looking outside of ourselves, I think it's important to remember that we all know what we really need, and we have all that we really need within us. The ability to live a happy and contented and peaceful life is already an intrinsic part of us. So looking to the outside for those things, to other people, or to the spiritual and ethereal, may not produce the same result that we can get simply by looking inside of ourselves. One of the questions that I ask myself is, gee, do I know what it is I'm really looking for on that spiritual path? That's a question well asked and well reviewed fairly frequently. An alignment of goals, if you will, an understanding of where it is we're trying to go. And once we've answered that question, are we willing to take the steps that are required to find that own personal salvation, to make ourselves into the person that we should be, and perhaps less the people we don't want to be or are, depending upon our particular situation. Thank you all very much.